Well, the journal started primarily because of some dissatisfactions with the way the accounting review was administered. In particular, they had some very stringent rules, such as articles had to be a certain length or less, and that their topics had to be very accounting oriented rather than broadly oriented. And so David Green, who was a full professor at Chicago, and Sidney Davison, also a full professor at Chicago, decided to start the Journal of Accounting Research. And in particular, they decided to expand on the narrow policies of the accounting review. And so they had no constraint on length of articles, had no constraint on really topics, as long as they had some bearing on accounting issues. And they asked me, David Green asked me in particular to edit a section that he liked in the journal, which was called Research Reports. He wanted that to be actually the flagship part of the journal, but instead the journal itself became its own flagship, and so the Research Reports section sort of just disappeared, you know. I didn't disappear with it, but the research section disappeared. So somebody had to take over the journal. Sidney Davison didn't really want to be an editor. He had too many other things going on for him. So he asked me to take more charge of the editorial policies of the journal, which I did. And eventually I just became the single editor of JAR. And he told me that I could do whatever I thought was good for the journal, and as long as I did that, he would not interfere at all with my editorial policies. And that's the way the operation went the whole time I had control over the journal, which I really appreciated. Selfishly. I shouldn't admit that. Actually, I always operated with myself as a sole editor. I mean, other journals have assistant editors and an editorial board and everything, and I never had that. I used to use outside reviewers, but I didn't put them on an so-called editorial board. Editorial boards sometimes embarrassed some people and made people get credit for doing things that they really didn't deserve credit for. So I always operated it by myself, and so papers would be submitted. I read every paper submitted, and I decided right then whether I thought it was appropriate for the journal at all, whether it should be just dismissed, you know, and sent back. And I sent probably quite a few of them back. Well, first of all, I wanted the papers to be competently handled, you know, the methodology and the logic and so on, and the data analysis and things like that. And I think all the papers I accepted initially, at least, were that way. I accepted some of the papers that Nick and Adis and I did as research papers, and maybe they were not as competent, but that's okay. Editors are supposed to have something to do, you know. So anyway, I made sure it was done that way, and I did not rely a lot on reputations, but I did rely somewhat on reputations. But if I thought a paper was done very competently, and the person had, if it was a new methodology, had consulted with people in the areas, the new areas, and so I accepted a paper, you know. Here were two very competent researchers introducing a new methodology for research in accounting. It looked promising, and I know it was originally proposed as a research methodology in finance, and had some very impressive co-authors, in particular Gene Fama, who eventually became a Nobel Prize winner. And so I looked at the paper and I read it, and I kind of liked the idea, and I kind of liked the whole approach, because at the time this happened, there were some researchers in accounting who were condemning the present journals, saying that they were not very useful, and they did not provide any useful information for making investment decisions or whatever you wanted to use them for. And so Brown and Ball actually wrote that paper, the information content of accounting numbers. They actually wrote that in a response to an Australian accountant who was very influential in that country, Ray Chambers. And they wanted to show that the accounting reports, as presently prepared, did in fact carry information, and they used the stock market returns, or the behavior of those returns, as a metric for assessing whether the reports had information content. And I thought that was rather clever. And I know the research methodology they use. They use what you call the event approach in accounting nowadays. It's called event studies approach. They use that methodology, and I knew it would be done competently, because these were Ray Ball and Phil Brown were very, very competent researchers, very careful researchers, and they learned their practices of handling data from Gene Fama, who used to pore over his research outputs. And so Phil Brown once told me, he said they didn't want to have any mistakes in the data popping up, and embarrassing them. And as far as near as I know, nobody ever called them into that charge, that they presented data that were not truthful. And so I took the paper. I thought it was a very good paper. And now that I look back, Ray Ball and Phil Brown have always been very kind to me as the editor, and saying, that I helped them with that paper and made them famous. And then finally, I wrote Phil Brown recently, and I said, you're giving me credit for making you and Ball famous, but I think you should know that you also made the Journal of Accounting Research famous, because until that time, it was a fledgling international journal, and all of a sudden it became very respectable and very influential in accounting research. And it started with that paper, I think. At least I like to think. Interesting that when Ball and Brown first presented their paper to an accounting workshop in Chicago, they were criticized because they did not show that the accounting papers were used. Accounting reports were used for decisions. They just showed that they had information content and could be used that way. And Beaver just picked up on that and said, well, let me see if the papers or the reports are actually used, and he did the volume study, which you put the two together and they make a nice package. And so we published both of those. So Beaver deserves a lot of credit for the initial impetus of that research methodology as well. Oh boy, probably my most influential accounting professor initially was Norton Bedford at Illinois. He had very broad ideas about the nature of accounting, and he probably whet my appetite for looking at other ways to expand accounting research. He wrote a paper on accounting income and how to expand its impact and its information content and so on. He's a very clever guy, very, very smart, and very generous with his time. And so he was the first one. And after that was probably David Green, whom I learned a lot about editing, how to edit a journal, and I learned a lot about being very sincere when you do this, and don't play favorites. No, I don't like to remember anything else. They embarrass me.
Chicago, Chicago, that toddling town, Chicago, Chicago, I'll show you around. I love it, bet you about $1 you lose the blues in Chicago.